Okay, this slideshow is designed um, to give you a little bit of insight into some of the developments in sculpture and painting during the Archaic period. It's a really fascinating period for the visual arts, for sculpture, painting, and other things. And what I want to do is take a look at some of the kind of key highlights or key points of these years and see how we can understand the visual arts as very much kind of emblematic, if you will, of the archaic age. As I've stressed, and as your textbook has stressed, that this is an incredible period of development, both kind of politically, economically, and culturally. And I think what we see is parallels between what we see in the visual arts and what we see in, say, in science and so forth. Especially this pattern of kind of pushing boundaries and kind of experimenting with different techniques. So it's fascinating to see some of these accomplishments of the Greeks, but also, as I say, they give good evidence of all the kind of great things that the Greeks are achieving during this period. And I'll set it into a little bit of context by kind of comparing it to what went before, the kind of Dark Age and the Mycenaean period. And we've seen a little bit of art from there. But then also try to kind of show you how it leads to kind of this period of the classical period when we get down around kind of 500 and 400, where we really see, the construction of the Parthenon and some of the world's great sculpture being produced. So it helps to understand how we get to that point too. So it's an important transitional period. Okay, now if you remember where we've kind of left off talking about art is, remember we had the collapse of Mycenaean civilization, of the palaces, and as a result of this collapse, we don't see really any significant trade, kind of trade levels plummet. And as a result of that, I mean, people don't have money, so they can't buy these kind of luxury goods, if you will. So um, this kind of goes on throughout the Dark Ages, and we see the loss of certain technologies in terms of spinning wheels for um, pottery and so forth. And some of the great frescoes that we saw in Minoan and Mycenaean culture and some of the pottery decoration and so forth, they just kind of fall by the wayside, and people lose those skills and they take a long time to recover. So what I want to do is kind of, that's the background. And so what happens, just as we've seen with the rise of Homer and the alphabet and so on, towards the end of the Dark Ages, we see those as a bit of a sign of recovery. The same thing kind of happens with pottery. So let me kind of show you some stuff here. Now, this kind of the first phase after the Dark Ages, when we're talking about pottery decoration, and I'm going to start with pottery decoration, and then I'll move on to sculpture, is known as proto-geometric. Now, I think the term itself you can understand because you can see the decoration is kind of geometric designs. Now, it may not look like much. It might seem kind of basic to you, but I just want to draw your attention to a couple things that just lets us know that, hey, this is a bit of a sign of recovery. Um, because if you look at some Dark Age pottery, and I apologize for not including some here, it's usually painted like a solid color, or it's not painted at all. The shapes are very basic. They're not, if they try to create a vessel like you're seeing on the screen here right now, it wouldn't be quite as well shaped. So what we start to see at this time is better pottery being produced, and this we're talking about 900 to 800 around that time. Better pottery being produced, not only in terms of a better wheel being used to spin the pottery, that's why the shape of this is quite good, but even the painting you can see here, it is geometric kind of parallel lines, but and even the wavy lines are parallel to some extent, right? What they have done here is they've kind of used a system of compasses, right, where they attach three paintbrushes together and then spin uh, the amphora or the vase, as you see here, to paint it in that way. So it creates these very kind of clean lines and very parallel, and it helps with these geometric designs. So you see a couple things that provide evidence that tell us, hey, things are getting a little bit better. The skills are recovering a little bit. I mean, we have ways to go, and this is what I'm going to track in this. But in this kind of first stage, what we see is kind of experimentation with different types of painting and so on. Okay. Now what happens, if you can see, this is another example, and you see here that the artist has made a good use of the kind of paint brushes that are kind of tied together, whatever, to create all these straight lines. But I also want to draw your attention to, He's also starting, I just mean general he, the artist. You can see he is on the neck of this amphora, you can see he has started to draw birds. So that's a little bit different, right? Because now we're seeing not just geometric shapes, but artists also trying to show you actual things they see, right? Birds and then eventually humans and so on. So that's an important kind of first step. So what happens now is that when we start seeing these things, and also more and more of the pot being covered, it's this shift from proto-geometric to geometric. And this is what we see in the next slide. Now, don't get too worried about these terms. I wouldn't ask you to kind of identify things, all right? But this is what's called a geometric amphora, okay? Now, these are really kind of characteristic of this period. We see a lot of them being produced. Now, these can be very big. They can be kind of 5 feet high sometimes. It's really kind of deceptive when you see it on the screen here. And what these were used for is for burial rites, right? And you were going to see that there's actually a funeral depicted on it. So this is it was used, either what they would do is they would cremate the body and place the ashes within this crater, this amphora, and then bury it or use it as a gravestone, okay? But I think what's important here is for a couple things. First of all, again, you can see they've built it quite well. It's quite imbalanced, right? The wheels worked well and all that kind of stuff. But when you take a good look at the close-up of the central scene here, right, you can see what's being depicted here is a funeral. Now, before I get to that, just look at the rest of this. It is absolutely just covered in geometrics designs. There's this term called horror vacui. Don't worry about that, but it means fear of empty space. And that's just because what we see on these is every effort made to just cover up every single space on the vessel. But also what I want to show you here is that what is depicted on it, and it's on the widest band, so you can see the artist kind of experimenting with space here a little bit. What we see is a depiction of what this vessel was used for, and that's for a funeral. So what we have here, it's kind of tough to make out, but you should make it out here, is we have the deceased, kind of sitting on a table, or what's known as a bier, B-I-E-R, and then the mourners on each side of him, and what they're doing is they're pulling out their hair, and then you have people sitting underneath and so forth. So there's stuff to kind of, what's remarkable here is that you notice even in these first few slides I've shown you, we've moved from kind of straight lines to birds, and now we have almost like a narrative, right? Somebody drawing a picture. Now the shapes of the bodies, they're kind of, they're not the best. They have these triangular torsos, as you can see right there. Aspect and perspective is a little bit kind of difficult for this artist to show. That's why if you see the dead body, it's almost looks like it's propped up and so on. But this is a big step, all right? We move from, as I say, actually trying to paint a scene on this. Now here's another example of one of these funerary craters. This one's a little bit different style. It's more when they're open like that at the top, that's called a crater. When it's more closed like the previous one, that's often referred to as an amphora. But here's another one. You can see it's very, very similar. In other words, it's a crowded scene. Everything's kind of taken up. You see some of those geometric designs, the cross hatching and all that kind of stuff. But you see an even more elaborate funerary scene on this one. Now, what I want to do is kind of take a close-up look at this, and it'll kind of bring out some of those details that were kind of maybe harder to make out on the previous slide. So you can see here we have a very elaborate funeral scene, right? So what we have on top is the laying out of the dead body of the deceased. So here he or she is laying on top of the table. And then you have the mourners to each side. The people right here, perhaps family, right? So this is the laying out of the body. And then the next thing what they would do is take the body, or if it was cremated, the ashes and so forth, on a procession to the graveyard to bury it. And that's why this is what we see on the lower register, right? So it's much like a funeral today, right? You have a wake, and then you take the body to the cemetery. But what's interesting here, you can see all the packed details here. Which is very good in terms of the artist has now tried to show different things, so it's not just a simple scene, and he's gone right around the whole vessel, so that's also kind of a step up, if you will, too. He started to show horses, right? So there's the horses here. You can see all their legs. What this looks like an apple core, that's actually a shield, right? The other thing, so there's lots of stuff going on here. Now, So we can applaud him or the artist for this. Now, at the same time, we can say, okay, this is a big step forward. But similarly, we start to see some of the shortcomings or some of the problems that these artists are facing. One is perspective, and this brings it out. I talked a little bit about it in the previous slide. But take a look. This is a table, remember? But you can see the artist has shown the four legs of the table, but it's kind of awkward, right? And same thing with the body. He can't show it like maybe an artist would today of somebody lying from a side view. It's almost like he's turned them on the side just to make sure that the viewer knows that, oh, okay, this is the dead body. Okay, and the same thing with it's kind of tough to make out, but if you can see the heads of these people, to show an eye, it's basically like a circle with a dot in the middle, and that represents the eye. So you kind of know what it is, but it's kind of basic, right? And then if you look down also at the horses pulling the chariot, I mean, you can see it's either, I think there's like three horses here, right? Or two or three horses here. It's my eyesight's not the best. But you can see another problem here is when you have three or four figures together, it's quite often hard to distinguish them. All right. In other words, it looks like one big blob here, the body. You don't kind of see differentiated body. And this is one shortcoming of this very basic style of kind of what's often referred to as kind of a black slip. So just the background is the color of the clay, and then all they have is a simple black paint. But if you have black on black, then of course you can't really distinguish. So that's a problem too. What's also interesting, if you take a look at the chariot wheels, it also kind of demonstrates problems with perspective. Everybody knows that, okay, chariots have two wheels and they're on an axle, right? But the artist, he can't kind of show that. So he just has to kind of put them one in front of the other just to let you know that, yes, this is a chariot and there's two wheels there, okay? So again, I hate to criticize these artists because, I mean, this is a really good piece of work for the time, but we're also starting to see some of the problems with the tools or the techniques that these artists are using. Perspective is a big problem. It'll take a while to kind of solve that. But then also just distinguishing features when you're using just basic black slip or just black painting on a plain background. When you have crowded scenes, especially with overlapping figures, it becomes a real problem to show that. And artists were starting to see this, and they're thought to themselves, you know, well, how can we solve this problem? And this is kind of an important step in the history of Greek art. So what they do here is they realize they've pushed the old kind of style of painting to its kind of limitations. And to kind of solve some of the problems that they are facing now, they come up with a new style of decoration, which is known as black figure. Now, the main difference here is that what they do now, it's very similar to what we saw before, is that the background of a piece is kind of left the color of the clay. Then you fill in, you paint in the people, but then you take this next step and you take a tool. It's almost like a pin or a kind of sharp drawing, a sharp carving object, like an X-Acto knife, and you carve out details, okay? So take a look at this new style of black figure. But just to give you a sense, okay, there's the old style, okay, and here's black figure. I think right off the bat, you can see some things are a lot different, right? So what you have to imagine when the artist was creating this is they'd paint, this is Heracles right here, okay? So they'd paint him in solid colors, and then what they'd do is they'd etch out or incise all these little details, okay, whether it be his hair or his armor, and over here the kind of chainmail or whatever, this warrior, and then their arms. And you can also see they've also added some different colors. It's almost like a little bit of a purple, but that helps to differentiate too, right? But just take, for example, a look at this shield and arm. Now, if this was the older where all they had was the black slip, this would be one solid blob, right? But now, because you can carve in and add that detail, it allows you to kind of show that. And it just allows for a much more detailed kind of painting. And also what it allows for is overlapping figures. So that's what we see here. This is actually Heracles fighting this kind of three-headed monster, if you will. But you can see it's all overlapping. So the artist is kind of saying, hey, now I can kind of do this, right? To bring it out even a little bit more clearly, what I've done here is on the left-hand side is black figure, and on the right you can see that's the older style, right? So what it does is it really helps you see the use of incision and color, but also lets you just see how much more detailed now that you can get. So not only does it allow kind of greater scenes and to differentiate different figures, but it just allows detail. You can show musculature in the bodies, you can show their hair even, and so on. And the artists really push this technique too. Just to show you kind of some other examples here. Here's another example, right? All sorts of stuff going on. This depicts a boar hunt. So that's what you see, this boar here and a hunter there, right? But now you see different kind of scenes that they can provide. So when we talk about the onset or the development of black figure style of decoration, I want you to understand a few things, right? First of all, just kind of what it is and what it allows and so on, and how it marks an improvement to previous kind of generations of artistic production. But I think it's even more important, perhaps, and this is what I'm kind of getting at with this second point here, is that just the creation of black figure itself, it sets this pattern of a problem and a solution. Now, what I mean by this is that we see this throughout Greek culture during these years, is that these artists, and then we'll later see with philosophers and others, would push the boundaries of what they presently had at hand in terms of technology or painting technique and so forth. But once they reach the boundaries of that, right, and they realized its limitations, they took that important next step to try to reach the next level. And this is what really sets the Greeks apart from so many other cultures in different times in world history, is that not everybody always takes that next kind of step, but they do. And this is what really, is to say, it's very characteristic of this period. And it's just something we see again and again. Another thing I just want to draw your attention to is that, remember, with the Greek recovery, we see kind of in the Archaic period, we see the growth of wealth and so forth. And that's as a result, you have to understand the connection between economics and art, right? It's the people, wealthy Greeks, the elite and so forth, they wanted these high-end luxury goods. And as a result, that created a market for potters and painters to produce these kind of things. So it's really kind of a lot of times it's kind of economic necessity that's driving some of these artistic accomplishments. Now, just to show you a few examples of this, the other thing that's important here is not only economics, but also culture, generally speaking, too. If you remember, in this chapter, there is a section on the rise of the symposium, these kind of aristocratic drinking parties. And when you were having those parties, just like fancy dinner parties today, you needed the necessary accoutrement, you needed the glasses, you needed the mixing bowls, and all those kind of things. So these two also help drive this demand for these luxury goods. So what you're seeing on the screen here, this is actually a Greek wine glass. You can see it's a little Greek wine. First of all, would have been, it's very strong, so they mix it with water. So there's a special vessel for that, and then they pour it in this, which is called a kylix, from which you would drink. So this is why we see so many of these produced in this period, because they're needed for the symposium and other things. Okay, here is the underside of one of these drinking vessels, and what's kind of interesting here is you can see it's a scene taken from Dionysus, who's the god of the grape and wine, so that kind of makes sense. And his followers were kind of known as satyrs and so on, so you can see them kind of getting out of control and drunk and so on down there. Another thing that's kind of interesting is this. This is called a psikter. Don't worry about that. It just means kind of like a cooler. Greeks like their wine kind of cool, but of course there's no refrigeration in the ancient world. So what you would do is you get the kind of coldest pot of water that you could get, right? And then what you do is you'd pour wine in the top here, and then place this within the kind of bucket, of water. And then what it would do, it would float in it, and then the contact would chill it down. Okay, and then you pour it out, and you have your nice kind of cool wine. So we see a lot of these used as kind of a cooler, almost like an ice cube or something like that. Now, we've been talking about black figure, we've been talking about what it represents and so forth. Now, in my mind, when we talk about black figure in the Archaic period, its masterpiece or its culmination is this right here. This is by an artist known as the Exekias painter. Don't worry about that. And what it depicts in its central frame is Achilles versus Ajax, and they're playing a board game. Now, these are two of the leading warriors, of course, on the Greek side in the Trojan War, and this is during a break in competition. But I think what we see here is a real, it is a masterpiece, there's no doubt about that. A real, as I say, just a culmination of everything where we see incredible technique, use of space, and so on. So just let me kind of draw your attention to some things here that might not kind of immediately leap out at you. The first thing that's kind of remarkable is just the tremendous detail of this piece, right? Especially, this is Achilles right here, his cloak. Okay, now, this is actually a pretty big amphora. Probably a couple feet high, so it looks much bigger in person. Now, this is located in the Vatican. I saw this kind of relatively late in my life. I was kind of about 40 years old when I first saw this, although I had kind of seen it in pictures for a long time. And as soon as I saw it, I mean, the cloak, it's really tough to get across here, especially with that darn glare there. But his cloak, the detail on it is just, and you can see it a little bit on Ajax's too, is just incredible. The artist must have spent hours and hours and hours just carving out all these tiny details. So in terms of sophistication and technique, it's just really is remarkable, right? And even the hair and so forth, just the detail. And you can see they actually, most paintings are labeled. You can see the names on them. Achilles is actually here saying tessera, which means four. And he's a roll of four. So they're just playing that game, but really remarkable. The other thing that's cool is you can see this artist has given a lot of space or a lot of thought to kind of the layout of the scene. One of the most obvious things here is Achilles, of course, is the greatest of the Greek warriors, right? He is the ultimate warrior, if you will, of the Greek side. And his prowess, as you can see, is he's a bigger guy. He's just depicted as taller than Ajax. That's why he has the helmet on top of his head. And Ajax himself is considered like the second best of the Greek warriors. But Achilles has to be seen as better, so that's why he's just a little bit taller there. The other thing is when you take a look, I've mentioned a few times in these slideshows that the use of space is important, right? How you distribute it, where you put your figures. And here too you can see this artist has really given a lot of thought to things. Because first of all, of course, at the widest spot, that's where the main scene is. Okay, that makes sense. That's not too incredible or whatever. But if you take a look at the balance here, if you take a look at the backs of the two warriors, it matches, right, the sides of the amphora. So it's not something that really kind of strikes you, but once you do, like, oh, okay, that adds to the harmony of it all. And also take a look at their swords, right? They both are holding their swords here, but take a look. They point up towards the handle, right? Both of them. And not only do that, but then they wind around and they're paralleled by their shields that are sitting behind them. See? Same thing right here. So it creates this really kind of nice balance, and it's also paralleled by their feet and so on. So it's so much. This is so much Greek art we'll see. Then we get down to the Parthenon too. It's very balanced and very kind of harmonious and organic. Because those are all kind of terms that are often used. But it's really, you have to kind of pay attention to some of those details just to see how that is accomplished. So, we started talking about protogeometric and black slip, and then we talked about how we see the onset of black figure and how it can be used, especially for detail, right? So this is, as I say, culmination. It's a really, really great piece of work. But even at the same time we see some of these great things being produced, one of the kind of shortcomings of black figure, it really wasn't the best for showing movement. That's why so many of the things you see seem to be relatively static. For example, two guys playing a game of checkers or dice or whatever. There's not a lot of movement going on there. So that is, one of maybe the shortcomings of black figure, is that it was tough to show a lot of perspective and movement. Okay. And the Greeks realized this, and they also came up with a solution for that. So let me proceed to that. Now, what I want to do here is just show you something and see if you can notice the difference. Right? Here's black figure style. This is actually Dionysus. You can tell by all the grapes around there and so forth. But it's a good job. Painted black, inscribed detail, added colors, etc., etc. So take a close look at this one. All right. Now take a look at this one. Similar scene, Dionysus sitting on a thing, but there's a difference, right? So I'm just gonna take a look at that, some detail. All right. I'm gonna go back for a second. Now take a look at Dionysus here. This is the basic, the essence of this new technique. Take a look at his body, right? Black with details incised out. Take a look at this one. His body is left blank. You can see the difference here. On the previous slide, his body was all black and cut out. But what they've done here is the background is black. So it creates the outline. And then what you do is you paint in the detail. You don't incise it anymore. Okay? Now this new type of style is called red figure. And as I say here, the basic elements here are you kind of invert the paint. So before you would leave the background, if you will, the color of the pot. But now you paint that in, and then you paint in the details. You draw in the details rather than incise them. Okay? So take a look at this. Again, black figure, right? The background, color the clay, paint that in, and then you carve out the details. This one, now you paint in the background, right? You basically do a silhouette of Dionysus, and then you paint in the details. Okay? So this is what it looks like. Now this is a very famous piece. But what's interesting here, this is red figure, okay? Because you can see that they've painted all the figures in outline and then painted in the details. Now why this is so important is that it actually becomes a more kind of supple tool for showing, especially musculature, the body, right? You can see the kind of stomachs and all that kind of stuff, but also perspective. Right? In other words, you can see people from more than side views. You can see people now from, say, 3/4 view. And that's why these artists, you can see on this one here, what he's depicted. Because if I just backtrack, remember in black figure, the problem was showing movement and showing perspective. Those two often go hand in hand. Now with this new red figure style decoration, take a look at this piece that's produced. What does the artist do? Well, he shows people exercising. They're kind of throwing the discus and other things there. So in other words, they're in movement. So the artist is almost kind of boasting, hey, look at my new technique. I can show athletes and so on, right? And not only athletes, but people from different perspectives. So you can see the bodies. This is not the best. We have other examples, but you can see we get these perspectives of athletes, of individuals that we just didn't before. In the past, it was just kind of side view or from the back or from the front. But now we have people from the side, 3/4 view, etc., etc. Right? Here's another one. All right. So you can see here the whole thing is black except for the individual, right? But what's kind of interesting here, another thing that red figure is very good for is drapery. You can see they've drawn this on very well, and for it being kind of flowing and stuff, it's very good for that. But even the pose that this figure has struck, right? He's kind of it's like a little weapon and so forth. It's, in a weird stance. This just would not have been as possible in black figure. So that's the real answer for at this time for some of these problems. And a lot of art historians have really laid emphasis on the importance of red figure because it's red figure that really allowed artists to start experimenting with perspective and so on. And for those of you that are in art history and you've taken a look at the Renaissance and so forth, where Italian artists had to rediscover the use of perspective, you see the same thing going on here, right? These artists kind of trying to push the boundaries and kind of come up with solutions. So hopefully this look at just pottery decoration, black slip and then black figure and red figure has given you a real good sense of some of the stuff that's being produced, but also how it is, as I say, kind of emblematic of the archaic period and this energy of kind of exploration, of kind of testing new things and so on. It just seems really distinctive. And I say we see this in art, but we've already seen it a little bit with politics, right, with the rise of the polis, and we will see it in science and philosophy and other things. It's a really kind of important thing to understand. The next thing I want to do here is take a look at sculpture. But here too, I'm also going to kind of take the same sort of tack, and that is just try to show you how the artists are coming up with some of their ideas and so forth. Okay. Now I want to turn to sculpture. There wasn't a lot of history of large-scale sculpture in Minoan and Mycenaean culture. Most of what we saw when we're talking about representations of, say, human beings was more kind of small figurines. But Greeks were familiar with sculpture, of course, from other cultures. Now, I do want to kind of invoke Egypt here, because Egypt, of course, had been around for thousands of years. The pyramids are built 3000 BC, more or less, right? So it's the ultimate kind of ancient civilization for the Greeks, that in Mesopotamia. And of course, we've talked about how they had regular contact. So they saw the artistic productions of the Egyptians and they came across their sculptures, so on. And they would have come across something like this, right? I think this is dated to around 33,000 BC. So roughly kind of, what's that? Not great at math, so kind of 2,200 years before where we are now in our course. And you can see what kind of a pharaoh and his wife, or whatever, a man and his wife, but you can see here the main thing I want to see is just the depiction of the bodies, especially the feet. You can see, especially on the male figure on the left, you can see one foot in front of the others, the kind of hands down by the side, kind of firmly clenched. His wife has his her arm around his side. But if you see his stance, it's pretty rigid, right? And these are the kind of things that the Greeks would have seen had they traveled, or when they traveled to Egypt. Okay. Now, what we start to see here is at this time, so here we're thinking the kind of around, say, ballpark 750, 700 BC in Greece, is the Greeks take their opportunity to start carving out these sculptures for the first time, large-scale sculptures. So what we see during this period are the creation of a lot of male and female statues. They're usually of young people, and these are often commissioned by upper class or elite families as offerings in various religious sanctuaries. So it became common for them to be produced in that context. So that just kind of helps you explain why these are being created at this time. But as you can see here at first glance, okay, on the left we have the Greek, and on the right we have the Egyptian. Now you can see already, right, is that the Greeks have been influenced by this, because take a look at the stance. I mean, the stance is identical. Look at the hands, look at the feet, right, everything. Right? Even the hair looks like a bit of a copy, right? So that tells us, I mean, I doubt it's coincidence, right? Especially because of context. So it's like the Greeks, when they're just first starting out with sculpture, they thought, okay, how we're going to depict people. So here we go. All right. So on one hand, you might think, oh, they're just kind of copying the Egyptians. But at the same time, all right, you have to realize that the Greeks didn't just kind of simply adopt something, but they adapted it. And this is why, if you take a look at these are the same statue, right? But what this textbook has done with this with the picture on the right has kind of added these details just to draw your attention to the balance that the Greek artist is trying to create. Right? Now, when the Greeks looked at the human body, they saw it as being kind of balanced, right? Because you have two eyes, you have two hands, you have 2 feet, you have 2 legs, right? So this is the idea that it's almost kind of like a mirror reflection of one another, and that there was a bit of kind of symmetry and unity in the human body. And they tried to bring this out through their sculpture. So in this, they mark a bit of a departure, from their Egyptian predecessors. So just to try to kind of explain this to you in a little bit more detail instead of just blathering on, you can see here what this textbook has done has just shown you how the artist has managed to create a bit of balance and symmetry. It's pretty subtle, and this is why the lines are introduced here to make it more obvious to you. But if you take a look around, they've drawn this line basically through the figure's navel. Right now, if you think of that as a kind of dividing line, then you notice his upper rib cage, it's shaped like a sharp triangle, and it's matched by the shape down towards his groin. Okay, so you can see there's this kind of parallelism that's created, and the same thing happens in his chest. If you draw a straight line through, say, where his nipples were or whatever, this shape almost looks like a upside down mustache or something, where his collar, that marks his collarbone. It is paralleled by the shape underneath his chest, under his pectorals. So that creates balance too, right? And then you also notice that yellow line underneath there, it's matched by the yellow lines above his knees. So that creates a balance too, right? And the other thing, it's kind of tough to make this out, but this V shape here is also kind of paralleled by the deep V's on the elbows, okay? So it may not seem like much to you, but what it does provide evidence is that these Greek artists weren't just simply taking something and kind of willy-nilly copying it. Rather, they were taking it and saying, okay, this is the starting point, but then they put their own take on it. And that's why when you take a look at the Egyptian statues, if we just look back for a second, they don't have this kind of same sort of parallelism and so forth, this kind of unity of the human body that the Greeks did. So that marks it as a bit of a departure. Now, what's interesting, though, is if you take a look at this is an early example, right? And if you say, okay, is that a realistic depiction of the human body? Well, not really, right? It's kind of rigid. I mean, certainly it looks, a lot of people say it looks like an alien. It's got these kind of bug eyes and all that kind of stuff. So in terms of it being realistic, no, it's not that realistic, right? But it's a start. So what happens if you take a look at there, and I would describe this as very kind of geometric, right? Because, well, look at all this kind of stuff. And a lot of the lines here are quite sharp. Now, if you take a look at, say, we'll call it the next generation, right? Where these artists say, oh, okay, what else can I do now? This is a kind of example, right? And now you can see it's also kind of weird, but I think the first thing you'll notice about it, it's a little bit more rounded, right? The chest, especially the legs, and so forth. It's not quite as harsh. The lines are starting to get a little bit more rounded, so it's starting to look a little bit more natural. I mean, he's got a weird belly, but whatever. And you see another similar one. This is kind of the next generation. So what I'm trying to get across here is this is, say, first generation. All right. Now for down here, this is kind of, we're talking about kind of second generation. And here too, again, this obviously looks a little bit more rounded, right? Even though it almost looks like a little bit inflated. That's what people sometimes talk. The musculature, excuse me, is starting to look a little bit more natural. Some people have pointed out, though, it's a little bit awkward because what you have is, okay, this is starting to look natural, but the hair is the same as the first generation. So there's a bit of a clash there because that's more kind of a geometric design, whereas this is starting to get a little bit more naturalistic. But anyways, it is an improvement. You can see them kind of striving for this. All right, and there's just another view of it. Kind of brings it out well. So you can see here the artists, they're striving for naturalism. The problem here is the hair. Another problem, look at that stance. The stance really hasn't changed at all. I mean, those arms look kind of odd, so stiffly attached and so on. Okay. Now, so that's the kind of limitations, right? They're getting better at showing the body, some curvature and so forth, but it doesn't look terribly natural yet, especially in its pose. Right? Now we get even down. Oops. Here is, say, the next generation here. And why I include this one, it's not that different, but I think what's important here to note is that they've gotten rid of the kind of ponytails at the back, right? So getting that out of the way helps to mark a break from those early geometric designs. And the body has kind of been deflated a bit. Now it's nice and rounded, so it's starting to look a little bit more natural, right? So it's an improvement. So if you look at that, I mean, the guy's got these huge thighs, right? And then here, it's just looking a little bit more streamlined and a little bit better. And the hair, too, okay? But again, the stance, it's still pretty much the same. Now, if we take a look at the next generation, if you will, it's this one, right? This is a pretty famous piece. And why it's so famous is it kind of is very similar to the preceding piece in that the musculature is kind of simplified. It actually looks pretty good. It's not kind of inflated. The hair is kind of brought down. The eyes are empty. They would have been filled with gems or whatever. But if you notice, just think for a second, what is different here? He doesn't have any arms, whatever, in the lower parts of his legs, right? But there's a very important difference here between this one and this one. You can see it a little bit. He's just cocked out his hip a little bit. You see that? It doesn't look like much. But it's kind of what it's done is that these statues have now broken free of that previous rigid state. And what these artists now are kind of saying we've kind of perfected the kind of standstill. So what we have to do now is start to show a little bit of movement to kind of change things up. And just that little hitch in the side, right? That little movement out to the side, it just starts, what that does is kind of unleashes this idea of movement. Okay, it is a really kind of important breaking point or developmental point in Greek artistic history, and even in kind of world artistic history, because this stance, what we're getting to is what's known as the contrapposto stance, this kind of S shape that we get that goes like that, right? And that'll become more and more common when we get down to the classical period. All right. So what's interesting here, because I just want to be a little use a bit of a dramatic contrast here, is that okay, now the artist saying, now we can have our statues actually depicted as if they're moving. Okay, and this is why very shortly thereafter we get something like this. Okay, now this is either Zeus or it's Poseidon, right? Either hurling a thunderbolt or a trident. It doesn't matter, right? It's obviously one of the elder Olympian gods. Now, there's a couple. First thing you should notice: this is bronze. Okay, this isn't stone like the previous ones. At this time, Greeks were also starting to experiment with the creation of bronze statues, and that actually became the norm. Most of the statues that you see in pop culture today from antiquity, when they're made out of marble, these are usually kind of marble copies of the bronze originals. The problem is that bronze can deteriorate quite quickly, especially if it's left in a shipwreck or in the ground and stuff like that. The stone marble just lasts a little bit longer. So we're very lucky if we find something like this. Okay, but what's really remarkable is first things first. The first, what I'm really trying to stress your attention to is remember in the previous generation, this one, all right, we start to see a little bit of movement. Then what happens? Then we start seeing God's hurling thunderbolts or whatever, right? So that type of movement, you can see these artists. It's kind of like what I talked about the pottery painting before. These artists are really kind of boasting about what they can do. So here we see them saying, "Oh, now I'm going to show somebody hurling a thunderbolt." And the other thing that they start to do here is they start before in the past, something like this, in terms of a viewing angle, you really had to look at it from the front, like from dead straight, right? If you went down to the back, it doesn't make much sense. You go to the side, it doesn't make much sense. It's improving a little bit here, but it's still not great, but it is improving a little bit. So we do start to see artists thinking about, okay, well, what if, what about perspective for different viewers? What if they're standing in a different place? So this will be something that they continue to work on too. The other thing that's kind of important to note here is I've been talking about them experimenting with movement and so forth. Well, bronze, the increasing use of bronze helps this development too, because bronze is lighter. So it allows some of these artists to put their statues, their figures, in poses which would have been problematic had they been stone. If this arm was going to be made out of stone, it would be quite heavy, so then they had to build in supports and stuff like that, maybe some sort of background. But now that it's made out of bronze, it allows them. So it kind of goes hand in hand. Not only do they start thinking about movement, but at the same time they start experimenting with bronze, which helps them do it. So it kind of has this kind of exponential effect and just kind of shoots development forward. Here's another one. Take a look at this. I'm sure you've seen this, right? This is called the discobolos, which just means a discus thrower. Bolos means to throw. Discus, that just means disc. But this is a famous. We're getting kind of close to the classical period here. But take a look at where we've come, right? Think about this. We've come from, let me just go back here, right? From this statue. Static, right? Geometric, awkward looking. Now we get down to an athlete, right? So I've been talking about movement. So what else would they show except for athletes? All right, so it all kind of fits in here. So this is what's remarkable about here is not only take a look at the physique, right? This is kind of classical or whatever. And what I mean by that is that you don't see any imperfections. It's a young body. We'll get to that eventually. But if you compare the musculature here compared to earlier period, obviously much improved. And even the torsion in the belly, right, when he's hurling a discus and so on, right, is really impressive. So that kind of skill you see. But also, I think it's important to remember, if you remember when we took a look back at the Executive painter and black figure and red figure painting and the use of space and so on, here too you can see even these sculptors giving thought to the shape of things, right? And here too, I think we see a bit of very kind of harmonious organic whole, and it works when you just look at it. But just here again, just let me draw your attention to a couple of things that really, when you see them, like, oh, okay, now maybe that adds to it, okay? So if you take a look at the space, okay, this guy's about to hurl this discus. But if you take a look at the shape of his body, right, if we start up here at the discus, and we go around here, right, then we go down his arm, right, and then we go all the way down here. So you see how that kind of works as one kind of movement there, or one shape, right? It kind of just gives it this kind of harmonious look. The other thing is if you take a look at this, so that's a nice curved angle, but then take a look at this. There's a nice right angle, and it's matched down here too. Okay, so you can see the artists have clearly given a lot of thought to where different parts of the body go and how they can. I mean, if this was hanging off up here or something like that, it clearly wouldn't have the same sort of effect. So this is why you see some of these artists making such good use, and this is why these are kind of classic pieces, right? Now, when it comes to sculpture, and the other thing about the Discobolos is that the artist, the viewer can look at it from different angles and appreciate it. So they are giving more thought to viewing angles as well. But when we talk about sculpture, just kind of backtrack. I've been talking about how we move from these very basic male statues, geometric kind of designs, if you will, kind of lifeless, up to the depiction of athletes in bronze. Everything kind of culminates with this. Now, this is a kind of marble Roman copy of a very famous sculpture. Now, this is classical. I'm kind of getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I just see this as very much the product of the Archaic period. In other words, everything kind of works towards this when we're talking about sculpture. Dori for us means the spear bearer, the spear carrier. Doru is just the word for spear, and foros just means to carry. And it originally would have had a spear right through this hand. Those kind of details were often added in bronze or even wood. Okay. The thing that's remarkable here, although, is that we just seen how far we see with this how far we've come from that very early period where we had a very rigid stance, right? This is the perfect kind of contrapposto S stance. So you can see he has that kind of hip hinge or whatever, so it kind of comes like this and then goes back like that. That's that kind of S shape, the contrapposto stance they talk about, right? The other thing is that you see now that he's not looking directly ahead, but rather off to the side, right? And that's important too, because that gives you a little bit of kind of variety. Even here, it looks like the guy's just standing, but kind of like the Discobolos, they've given thought here, right? So you can see this straight arm is matched by this, and then this leg, which is bent at almost a right angle, is matched by this arm that's almost at a right angle. Okay, so there too, there's kind of balance that's being created. And also the thing is, when you take a look at the Dora Foros, it's a little bit better than some of the others at different viewing angles because you can see it, like part of his face here, then you can see these arms and that leg from the other side and so on. So it's a little bit better in that regard too. But this just kind of becomes the standard for kind of classical sculpture just because of that stance, because of the use of the kind of the limbs and how they're kind of conveniently put or arranged, if you will, and how his head is kind of tilted and looking slightly down. And what's interesting is that when we take a look at later Roman artists, they will use this as a model for Roman generals. Like one of the most famous statues from Rome it's called the Prima Porta Augustus. It's a statue of the Emperor Augustus, and basically looks identical to this, the same pose, and we'll take a look at it when we turn to Roman art. Same pose, except he couldn't have a Roman emperor naked, so he has like a breastplate and all that kind of stuff. And the only other difference is that he has his arm raised as a Roman general, but it's obviously looking back to this great classical Greek sculpture. So again, I just want to really kind of draw your attention to remind you just how far we've come in a couple hundred years when we go from something like that, all right, all up to something like this. And this, as I say, is not only a model for the Greeks, but Renaissance artists, I mean, they all copy this. I mean, it's better than most of the stuff that was produced then. It's really quite incredible. So I hope that this slideshow on the visual arts, kind of pottery, painting, and sculpture has given you a sense not only of some of the things that were being produced and some of these great statues and the artistic accomplishments, just gives you some insight that way. But also, as I say, I want you to understand how the visual arts really gives us insight into, the spirit, if you will, of the Archaic period, and how this kind of pattern of experimentation, of pushing boundaries, of recognizing limitations and problems with technique or with style, and coming up with new answers to overcome those. That really marks the kind of Greek genius, if you want to say something like that, or just helps to explain the incredible accomplishments of Greeks during this period. So hopefully that's been useful. And as I say, we'll return to a lot of this not only when we take a look at classical art, but also when we took a look at Roman art, because just as the Greeks often looked to the Egyptians, well, the Romans looked to the Greeks for inspiration too. Okay. So that is it for this show.